The trade truce between the US and China delays their economic battle but creates little hope for lasting resolution of the deep divide between the two nations on the future of the global economy, according to many China analysts. President Donald Trump and China hawks in his administration have frequently criticized prior U.S. presidents for being outmaneuvered and outsmarted by China's tactic of engaging in endless negotiations and holding out the promise of reform while continuing to carry out its economic predation. The Obama administration spent years in what was known as the strategic and economic dialogue without anything of substance to show for it. To critics of the Buenos Aires truce, the Trump administration appears to be repeating this mistake. The president has fallen into the same trap as Barack Obama, George W. Bush and even Bill Clinton. He will get more platitudes and promises and very few results, University of Maryland economist Peter Morici told the Wall Street Journal. One former administration official described the deal as a total disaster. "We've now entered into the Trump version of the strategic and economic dialogue," the person said. Some conservative China critics say that the deal could have been worse. For weeks leading up to the dinner, many feared the U.S. would agree to end or suspend the 10% tariffs. From that perspective, the worst-case scenario was avoided because the Trump administration only agreed to a pause in escalation. Not all analysts were as negative about the deal, but few believe the US and China were close to resolving their fundamental differences, in large part because China's global ambitions would be thwarted by a deal that did resolve them. The Financial Times' Brendan Greeley wrote, "China and the US aren't fighting over what China exports now: assembled electronics, toys, socks, furniture. They're fighting over what China wants to make at home in the future. China has a plan to become self-sufficient in electric cars, aerospace, biomedicine, and farming equipment. These things are hard to make. They require decades to figure out, and a well-educated, productive, high-wage workforce. Xi Jinping didn't compromise on this goal in Argentina. It's hard to see that he ever will. It's good to see the U.S. Chinese tariffs war not escalating any further," Kong Kam-chan, head of the South Korean Trade Ministry's Trade Policy Division, said Sunday, according to the Wall Street Journal. But the competition for holding hegemony in global industry and trade between the two powers has not changed substantially. The outcome of the Trump/Xi dinner on Saturday represents nothing more than a truce in the escalating trade wars, former Goldman Sachs partner and ex-chief of the British Broadcasting Corp, BBC, Gavin Davies wrote in an op-ed for the Financial Times. Entrenched problems remain, notably around U.S. concerns about the protection of intellectual property, and the long-term direction of Chinese industrial strategy. It is still very difficult to imagine that these gulfs can be bridged without further threats of trade protection from the Trump administration. Less than 24 hours after the deal was struck over a dinner capping the Group of 20 meeting in Buenos Aires, Argentina, cracks in the truce consensus were already apparent. The U.S. made no mention of removing the existing 10% tariff. China's statements on the agreement, however, made no mention of a 90-day timeline or the possibility of tariffs rising if the deadline passed without progress. In a press briefing, Chinese officials said only that the talks would focus on removing the 10% tariffs and Chinese retaliatory tariffs. Chinese officials were also vague about what it might purchase from the U.S. as part of the deal. China's statement also said that Trump would visit China and Xi the U.S. The U.S. statement made no mention of bilateral visits by heads of state. Similarly, the official Chinese news agency said the U.S. would continue to welcome Chinese university students while the U.S. statement made no mention of the topic. This creates the possibility that there is less to the agreement than it seems. Or even that U.S. officials have heard in Chinese statements what they hoped to hear but not what China actually intended. The U.S. has a long history of misinterpreting the statements and intentions. During the Korean War, for example, China believed it had clearly signaled that it would have to intervene militarily if U.S. troops got too close to the Chinese border. Officials from the U.S., however, misinterpreted this signal, leading to armed conflict between the two countries that was only ended by the 1953 armistice. Neither side got their maximum demands, and it's not the first time in U.S.-China relations that both sides claim victory, said Michael Pillsbury, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and a defense official under presidents including Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, Bloomberg News reported. Even within the Trump administration, there is skepticism. Some administration officials have shied away from even describing it as a deal, preferring to call it an announcement, the Wall Street Journal reported. Some worry that Wall Street's reaction to the announcement of the truce, which is seen as likely to boost stocks, will encourage the president to soften his stance even further. The fear is that Wall Street will applaud this as progress and it will make it tougher to raise tariffs to 25% when the negotiations fail to achieve anything meaningful, one person familiar with the thinking of some Trump administration China hawks said. The higher stocks go on China hope, the more they have to fall. And it remains to be seen who will lead the talks that are supposed to follow the Buenos Aires truce. Recent trade talks with Canada, Mexico, and the European Union have been led by U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, known as a hawk on China. But the talks prior to the Buenos Aires dinner were led by a group headed by Treasury Undersecretary David Malpass. It is not yet clear whether the Treasury group will retain its lead role or whether Lighthizer's office will take over.